Hi everybody, it's Michael here. I'm just going to jump in and show you a project that I've been working on lately because I think it's kind of interesting on the railroad style houses. Sometimes they're called shotgun style houses. And that's when you have a pretty much a long, narrow space that goes from one room right onto the next room onto the next room. So it's basically you open up the front door, you've got a straight shot all the way through to the back door. And for this particular one, I've got a small foyer right here in the front. So you walk in from the front door. There's a window here. There's a small coat closet right there in this foyer area, and then there's a staircase that goes up to the second level. Now these houses are pretty narrow. So the upstairs are usually like dormered, or they have a pretty sharp peak to the roof when you go upstairs. So they're not a whole lot of space up in the upstairs levels of the houses. But most of the living goes on downstairs in the main. Have a living room over here. We've got a dining room over here. And then back into the back of the house, we have a kitchen that is a U-shaped kitchen, which is pretty nice and efficient back here. So a refrigerator, a U-shaped countertop that goes to the sink over here, around to the other side. And then there's a cooktop and a stove combination integrated into a cabinet over here. And then you have some upper cabinets for some storage here. So it's a pretty efficient kitchen. Unfortunately, a lot of times there isn't enough room to put like a dining table or any kind of dining seating inside of the kitchen. So that is really the case for this one as well. You know, a nice dining room over here on the side as well. So that's good. So they don't really typically need an eat-in kitchen. It would be nice, but it's just not in the cards for a house like this. So a little bit of history on shotgun houses. So they started off in America around the early 1800s, mostly in the South. And so what they did was they were very inexpensive to build, which is nice because a lot of times new immigrants didn't have a lot of money, especially way back then. So these were, typically less expensive houses to build. They were all made out of wood. So all of the materials that were used in them were not the more favored materials back then, for example. So they didn't have a lot of bricks. They didn't have a lot of mortar or clay type roof systems and stuff like that. So it was all wood, and a lot of times what that was it was just easier and less expensive to build. They would go up pretty quickly. So that's part of the early American history. Later on, probably toward the 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s, they started building these houses around where the railroad systems were going in. So they were easy to put up, nice, kind of meant to be more of a temporary housing situation, but became sort of like, little bespoke pieces of property that were along railroad tracks that were all different sizes and shapes and things like that. And most of the time they were where the railroad people that were building the railroads would live, and the people that were working on the railroads would live as well. So that was a nice thing. So the reason why they call it a shotgun house, there's a couple of reasons actually. There was a saw back when they started building these houses a couple hundred years ago, and the saw was called a shotgun saw, and it was just a nice way to cut coarse lumber, so the raw trees would be cut down with this saw. The second idea was that, and it's more of a folklore idea, is that you could stand in the front door and you could shoot a shotgun all the way through the house without hitting anything, straight through to the back door. So I'm not sure if that's true or not, but those are the two reasons why these type of houses, these long narrow houses, were named either railroad houses or shotgun houses. So for this particular one, I wanted to do a little bit of an idea of how to kind of rearrange them. So as you know here, if you're new to my site, I talk a lot about tricky houses. I talk a lot about like layouts that are harder to figure out. Sometimes I talk about smaller spaces, but the pretty much the common denominator of everything I talk about is small, awkward, tricky spaces. So what that means is, you have a hard time laying out the furniture. You have a hard time figuring out what your focal point is. You have a hard time figuring out like where to put furniture, what size of furniture. There's a whole number of things that I talk about. So that is really what this one's going to be all about as well. So when it comes to laying out this long, narrow space, there's a couple of considerations that are going on here. So let me tell you a little bit about what's happening here. I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. Starting in this front area here, we have a radiator that is over here. So this house has radiator heat all the way throughout. And so this is another kind of like older school type of architectural feature that you might encounter in some houses. Even now they have radiators. My house is from the 1950s, has that traditional cast iron radiator. and I do have radiator covers over them. So that's what is going on here when you see these little boxes over here. So you walk in the front door, you're kind of met immediately, as you walk in with a radiator cover that's right here inside the front door. That's heating up this space in here. You have this little coat closet over here off to the side, as I mentioned before, and the stairway that goes up to the top. Then you have a doorway, just basically a cased opening or a regular doorway that goes into the living room space. Now this house has a few little updates, which is really nice for this type of house. There's a fireplace over here on this wall, which has a very thin, or I should say probably narrow hearth to it, which is nice because it's not going to take up a whole lot of room. There's a couple of taller windows on either side of that, meaning that they're not coming all the way down to the floor. They're pretty much, they're hung a little bit higher than a normal size window. On the opposite side, there are the normal size windows that are pretty tall and hung down lower toward the floor. And then there's another radiator in between those two over here on this wall. And then you have another doorway that goes through over here to the dining room space. Same thing, a nice kind of square area, which can be tricky too. We've talked about that a few times here on my site. There's a window over here as well. It's I think this one might be, this one is the same size as the smaller windows next to the fireplace. And then there's a taller window on the opposite side with a radiator in front of it. Walking into the kitchen, now you have another radiator right inside the doorway there, but it's not, it's in line with where the little section of wall is. So it's not really in the way. It's just sort of right there as you're walking into the space. Then you have your refrigerator, your wrap around countertop, a nice little sink over here. And then there's two windows in the kitchen and of course the back door that goes all the way through, straight shot from the front door. So what makes this tricky? As we're looking at the living room space here, this particular client did not really need to have a television or did not require or want a television in the space. So they really wanted this space to be more of a entertaining space, a gathering space, a former, quote unquote, formal parlor type of a space where they can kind of greet their guests and entertain and talk and things like that, have a glass of wine, maybe have a nice cup of coffee in the afternoon with a friend from down the street. So this is more of a gathering space than it is an entertaining space. So they have different spaces upstairs where they have the television, and they didn't really need another television room, especially in a smaller house like this. Typically, there aren't basements either in these type of houses because, as I was mentioned before, they would go up pretty quick. A house built on a foundation with 1 or 2 stories. Most of the time, they were just long houses with 1 story, with 1 room following the next all the way down the line. And a lot of times they were probably around 12 to 15 feet wide. So that makes it a little bit tougher as well to lay out the floor plan. Now, when it comes to putting your furniture in a room that has 2 doorways that are pretty much parallel to each other, as they are here in this wall, and then you have an architectural feature in between. And sometimes I'll refer to that architectural feature as an obstruction only because it's an obstruction to a pathway. So even though this fireplace is pretty narrow and it's pretty much, right up on the wall and it's not really popping off the wall too far, it is still more of an obstruction because you have to negotiate around it as you're walking through the room because that's the same side that the doors are on. So add to that, you have this radiator, which is covered over here in front of these 2 windows. And that is another obstruction that you can't block because, of course, then that would block the heat in the room. So, for example, putting a sofa backed up against that radiator isn't really going to do much for the room, especially with the radiator cover on top. And there's no way for the heat to rise. The heat is coming out the front and then rising, on radiator covers. So that is something to really think about too. So what we did with this particular layout is I had a sofa and a couple of chairs. I also used a rug. So let me bring the furniture in so we can talk about that real quick. I want to show you what this all kind of came about to be. So as you can see, you walk through here, there isn't a piece of furniture in the way. There isn't a piece of furniture in the way this way. Now you will notice that the sofa does pop out a little bit in front of this doorway here. And I'm going to talk about that in a second, but I really want to concentrate first on why I chose to position the furniture in the center of the room in a conversation grouping, kind of like off to the side like this. So instead of floating it right in the center, which is what the instinct would normally be, is that if you're going to float your furniture, you're floating it in the center of the room. So you put down your area rug first, and then you use that as your guide points for where you're going to put the furniture. Typically, with an area rug, the sofa would go on the longer side of the area rug. So this sofa is perpendicular to the longer side of the area rug, which is something you can totally do, and sometimes you can't avoid doing it. So I used the area rug to define the space, the seating space, and I brought everything in a little bit closer together. So this is more of an intimate conversation grouping. So meaning that I brought the sofa in and I brought brought the two chairs in as well. Everything is on this rug. So the rug isn't terribly big. Rug is a 8 by 10, so that's a pretty standard size rug. And so bringing all of that in really creates that intimate seating group. It brings things in closer, but it also kind of makes it tougher to find pieces of furniture, accessory pieces of furniture, accent pieces like the coffee table and tables and things like that to fit into the space. So what I chose to do is I chose to bring in an oval shaped coffee table to go in between the seating group here. I use ovals and I use round shapes a lot of times in trickier spaces because they're easier to get around. And the reason why is because you have, no hard corners that you have to navigate around to get into the space. So as you can see, this corner kind of tapers back. You can really get in here nicely. You can sit in the sofa on both sides of it. There's room to walk around it, so you don't have to worry about it. Same thing with these chairs over here. You don't have to worry about banging your knee on the corner of the coffee. You kind of have to consider small rooms or trickier rooms, awkward rooms, as to being like a puzzle piece where you're trying to find the right pieces to bring in, the right pieces that are going to support what you want to do in the space. And a lot of times it's the shape of things. So just like a puzzle piece, you're looking at the shapes of the different, cutouts and bump ins and bump outs and things like that on a puzzle piece to work them into the puzzle where they're supposed to go. Same thing with a tricky living room or an awkward living room. You're looking for those pieces that are going to fit in. And as I was mentioning before, rectangle and square just usually doesn't work in a space like this. So the sofa isn't terribly big either. This is more of a studio size sofa, which is probably in the 78 to 82 inch range, and that's the outside arm to the outside arm. And what that really does is it gives you a nice, comfortable amount of inside seating, but not taking up a lot of space on the outside. And that's to be achieved mostly with the way that the arms look on this piece here. I don't know if we can kind of zoom in on this. We'll do it in a second. Bring it up a little bit bigger on the computer in a second. But the arms are skinny, so they're not rolled arms, they're not big arms and things like that. They're skinnier arms, and what they do is they open up the interior space for you as opposed to taking up a lot of exterior space. Same thing with these kind of chairs over here. I chose to do something with a very thin arm to them, so a very skinny arm to them, and that is something that I liked the look of. I also like the look that they were open on the sides as opposed to being completely upholstered and solid all the way around, so you can kind of see through the arms to different areas of the house. In smaller spaces, I talk a lot about the ability to be able to see through and around pieces of furniture, and that gives you it makes the room feel bigger, it makes the room feel more expansive. It's mostly an optical illusion, but it does help a lot when it comes to smaller spaces. I also put in a round or half round demi-lune table behind the sofa because there isn't room to do end tables on either side. And if I put an end table over here, it would definitely block this doorway or this pathway through the space completely. So putting a sofa table that has a little bit of a rounded detail on the back of the sofa will allow you to reach behind, put a drink down. It has a nice space for a lamp and things like that as well. But it's kind of taking the place of doing the end tables on either side. Now, in between the two chairs over here, I did a small drink table, which I'm also a big fan of using smaller drink tables or nesting tables that can be broken up in spaces like this too, because that is going to give you the functionality that you need without a big clunky piece of furniture that's going to take up a lot of visual weight in the room, but it's going to give you a nice surface to put something down on, like a glass of wine or your phone. This wouldn't be big enough to hold a lamp, but it's definitely big enough to hold your phone, a glass of wine, a cup of coffee, a snack, whatever you're going to do in the space. So that's why I chose to do that. And just to give the room a little bit of height, over on this wall here next to where the stairs are, I put a kind of like a larger etagere with a little bit of storage on the bottom and some open shelving on the top. A couple of floor lamps. So I got a floor lamp over here. I've got a table lamp back here. I've got a center chandelier style barrel lamp up on the ceiling, which is more of a flush mount piece. And then I have these 4 recessed lights that are in this space over here. I've got a few of them over here, one inside the closet, one in front of the window, one at the foot of the stairs. There's a chandelier over here in the dining room, which we'll talk about in a second. And then there's a couple of recessed lights and a ceiling fixture here in the kitchen as well. So that's giving it a lot of light. I typically like to use more surface level lighting, so like lamps or floor lamps, as opposed to ceiling lighting, because I feel like it gives the space a little bit more of an ambient glow, as opposed to having a lit from above thing. Nobody looks good in overhead light. That's the old adage. I totally agree with that. I would rather have light kind of more so on the surface level where you are than above, but sometimes you can't avoid it. And sometimes when you have a tricky room like this where there aren't a lot of spaces to put floor or table lamps, you do have to rely a little bit more on the ceiling lights. So you could have done something a little bit different too. Instead of having all these recessed lights, we could do a track light system up in the ceiling. Anything that's in the ceiling, ideally, I would usually put on a dimmer switch so that you can kind of control the intensity of the light coming through. It just gives things a little bit more of a happier ambient glow as well. Let's move over here to the dining room for a quick second. I will tell you about what's going on over here. So instead of doing a long rectangular table or a square table, again, one of those things that you have to think about when you're doing laying out a square shaped room, even though this room is not terribly tiny, it's bigger than a lot of rooms actually. I've done an 8x8 square dining room with a round table. This one here is a 12 by 12. It's pretty much a 12 by 12 square. And I did a smaller scale table, and that's mostly because the customer didn't need a big, dining table. So I did a smaller scale one. This one here is 48-48, so it's a 4-foot round table, and there's a nice chandelier above that, and enough room for 4 chairs. This is one of the things I talk about a lot. I like to angle my chairs back facing, with the back facing more toward the corners of the room. And what I find with that is it's just easier to get around the table when you have your chair backs sort of going back to the corners as opposed to going back to a wall. So even though this is a bigger style room that I usually deal with, I still like to use that as a more of a reference point too, because when you have a smaller, so say for example, this room was maybe 2 feet smaller. If you put a chair back over here, you would be backing it up into the window as opposed to backing it into the corner of the room. So you have an additional multiple inches, if not feet, to go back when you angle your chairs back toward the corners of the wall, as opposed to being flat up against a window or flat up against a wall when you're trying to back it out to get in and out of a seat in the dining room. And that's why I do that. So I also like to use pedestal tables, which is what this is as well. So a pedestal table is going to give you a nice base where you're not going to have legs to get in the way of you positioning yourself around the table. The nice thing about that too is you can squeeze a few more chairs around the table when you have a pedestal table like that, because you don't have to worry about people's legs being in the way of the table legs, for example. So you can really kind of maneuver things around a little bit better that way. I did a nice buffet over here in the corner, or on this wall over here, with a nice piece of art, a couple of buffet lamps. That's going to bring in some surface level lighting, as I was mentioning before. And then the nice chandelier up here on the top. Didn't do anything really that dramatic with the kitchen, because this is how the kitchen is set up, and there really wasn't anything that we needed to do. So it's pretty much these two spaces here that we were dealing with, the living room and also the dining room space. So if we pull this up into 3D, it'll take a second for it to populate here. So if we pull that up into 3D, I'm going to show you kind of like that theory of the shotgun house. So there you go. So you're walking in through the front door. You've got a clear visual shot all the way through to the back door. So theoretically, if you were to fire a shotgun, not saying that you should do this, but theoretically, if you were to fire a shotgun, you're firing it straight through and you're not going to be hitting anything. That's the theory, at least. Here we go. If we look at this space here, you can kind of see it's a very nice, very comfortable conversation group. Very classic, sort of 2 chairs, opposite a sofa, and that's going to give you that nice conversation grouping. There's a nice detail to these chairs, as I was mentioning before, where they're nice and open. You can see underneath the sofa too, so it has these nice little post legs that are in a brass finish on the bottom. That brass kind of informed all of the other brass choices in the entire space, going through to the living room, into the dining room. So all of the metal choices in the space are based on that. There's a little bit of a metal detail here, a brass detail on the edge of the chair. The round or I'm sorry, the oval shaped cocktail table is also a brass finish. There's a brass finish on the demi-lune back here. Notice that I did also use glass top tables. So that's another thing I like to talk about too in smaller spaces. Keeping everything as visually open as possible is one of those things to really think about. So putting a nice glass top coffee table where you can kind of see all the way through to the rug. And same thing over here. This has a glass top and a solid base to it. So being able to see, all the way through just opens up the space and keeps your vantage points open. So there's nothing visually obstructing anything in the space, and it just makes everything feel more open and airy. So in addition to keeping your arms of your chairs over here open, bringing in glass top things that have a lot of openness. So this etagere cabinet back here, it's pretty large. So imagine if this was a big solid piece over here, it would feel very imposing on the wall, especially right behind these chairs. There's probably only about maybe 2.5, 3 feet behind there. So having a big, clunky, visually obstructing piece of furniture would make the space feel a lot more tight too. So keeping your finishes in mind, I chose to do a kind of like a gray wash finish on this wood, very similar to the color of the wall. I didn't want a whole lot of contrast going on. I wanted it to be more serene. So the colors in the space are all, brought in through the rug. So the upholstery from the sofa is brought in from, some of the colors here in the rug. Same thing with these accent chairs. The lighter gray colors are brought in this, very subtle upholstery on the chairs too. And even the accent pillows are brought in from some of the more saturated blues and sort of rust colors that are in the rug back here. All of your art, very calm, very neutral, same thing. Brought it in as took the cues out of the colors from the rug. So that is my inspiration point for the room. And spinning it around here, I kept things very, very simple over here on the fireplace side. I didn't want to put furniture on this wall because I didn't want to obstruct this pathway any more than I needed to. So I kept this very open. Over here, I didn't want to have curtains hanging down to get in the way of going back and forth. I figured that this is just a cleaner look to make it work a little bit better. But I did put some nice curtains over here on these two windows on the side. So what I did instead of doing drapes on both sides because of the radiator in between, I treated this as one whole window, even though it's two separate windows. So I put two separate Roman shades on each window just to be able to have some light control and some privacy. So you can pull those up and down. Now the panels on the side, the curtain panels on the sides are pretty much decorative. They aren't going to be functioning. They're not going to open and close. Because I just wanted something that's going to give the wall a little bit of architectural structure, but I also just wanted to kind of soften the look of things too. And this is a nice thing to think about too. When you have a radiator in between two windows that are about the same size, just treat it as one big window, bring that curtain rod right across. Over here in the dining room, I did the same thing. I just brought in the curtain panels. This time I did frame the one single window, still brought in the Roman shade for a little bit of light control, and I brought in the curtain rod. Of course, it's not as long as the one in the living room, but it does give you that symmetry that kind of goes from one room to the next. And a lot of times, I've talked about this before too on my blog and different videos, I like to use curtain panels that are pretty close to the color of the wall, because a lot of times I'm working on very calm rooms. So this works particularly well in a bedroom. Instead of having a high contrast in a bedroom that you want to be relaxing, try to find curtain panels that are very much the same color as your walls. So if your walls are white, that's pretty easy to do. If your walls are a color, then it's going to be a little bit more tricky to do, but it does make a big difference when you have that continuity of color going on. It's much more relaxing. So for example, I wanted it to be a little bit more of a kind of casual, relaxing sort of space, for the client to visit with friends and whatnot. Over here in the dining room, I kept it very simple. I did a larger buffet piece over here on the wall, and I put a nice little piece of art above it, and then two buffet lamps. The table is right underneath the chandelier here in the ceiling. And then I just did a double piece of art here on the wall on this side. I didn't want to do anything else over here, so I put in a nice plant, and it just gives you some nice visual balance in this space. Kitchen, same thing. I did a very simple piece of art on the wall over here, as you're walking in. It's sort of right next to the radiator. There really isn't a whole lot of space to put something there, so I wanted to keep that pretty simple as well. And I didn't do a whole lot here in the foyer. I just did a nice piece of art here. You could bring in some more art going up the stairs if you wanted to, but I wanted to keep it more simple. That's really the whole goal of it here. But again, as you're walking through, you can kind of see how things are laid out. And let's talk really quickly before we wrap this up. I want to talk about this sofa being, if we scoot this way, you're going to see, let's see, it's back out toward the back door. Okay, so as you're looking through from the kitchen now into the living room, you can see that the sofa is in that pathway. So here's the side of the door. That sofa is out probably a good 1.5 feet or so in the pathway. So how that works is you pull that sofa in feet into the room. So you've got probably a good 4 feet. I would say this is probably a good 4 feet of space into the room. And that's how you can compensate for that sofa being in the pathway there. So it's not directly inside it's not backed up to this wall here with a third of the couch hanging out in that doorway, because I didn't want to do a very tiny couch. I wanted to do something that gave the homeowners an option to put 2 or even 3 people on this couch if they wanted to. I wanted something that has a little bit more of a length to it. We had to figure out a way to do this. And so that is really what you do. If we look at it from above, you'll see this a little bit more. So you walk in, you got about 4 feet of space here, but you still have a good probably 3 feet of space between here and the hearth of the fireplace. Now here's the mantle of the fireplace. It's actually back here. So you've got probably a good 4 feet of space between where the arm of the sofa is and where the mantle starts. But the hearth is something that is on the floor. It's another two. But that was kind of like the choice to make on the layout for this, is to pull that sofa in further into the room to give this space a nice classic conversation grouping, so that when I did that, I kind of automatically knew, okay, we've got either another sofa mirroring it on the other side or a couple of chairs. I decided to do the 2 chairs. You could do swivel chairs too. So for example, if you did have a television above the fireplace, you could have swivel chairs that would swivel toward the TV to watch it if you needed to. But for this layout, we didn't do that. And that's how you kind of compensate for having a little bit of a wider sofa in a smaller room or a narrow room, a 12-foot room, for example. Is you bump it into the middle of the room more, and that gives you some grace to walk into the room without having to feel like you're bumping right into the back of the sofa. And then you also have that demi-lune table that's behind. Again, that rounded piece is very intentional too, because this would be a probably secondary pathway to get around over toward the windows. Same thing back here. You can certainly access both sides easily. And that is really key to having something round back here. So if it was squared off, this would take up more floor space. You would feel more confined over to this space here. Because it tapers down on the sides and it's wider in the middle, you could be walking in and you're literally navigating around the corner of the table naturally as you would walk through the space. Okay, so that is what a shotgun house layout would look like. You could do a couple of different layouts if you needed to, but this is really the dilemma, I guess you could say, of a shotgun house, because they're narrow rooms, usually 12 feet wide or less. One room right after the next, all the way through to the back. And you can clearly see right from the front door to the back door without any obstruction at all. So that is a shotgun or railroad style house. So hopefully you enjoy the video, and I'd love to hear some comments below if you think that this is a good way to do this. If you would do it a different way, certainly let me know that too. And we'll see you next time. Thanks for stopping by.